Hi, so this is the lecture on 20th century modernist poetry that I have finally managed to do for you. And I'm just going to really run through these pretty quickly, but I wanted to talk about how they were connected to the modernist movement. The first poem is The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. And a lot of you mentioned in the annotations that you felt this was connected to religion. And it certainly is. Like, it's in the title. This is this kind of apocalyptic despair. The second coming is literally part of the apocalypse, right? That modernists felt. So, this first section of the poem on the left, first stanza, talks about how the world is falling apart, literally, things fall apart. These lines 5 through 8 kind of refer to the Russian Revolution, that the effects of World War I, the Russian Revolution, just all of these kind of political things are happening. A huge war, and all of these old orders are falling. These two lines, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. The best for Yeats would be the aristocrats. He's pretty conservative politically. And remember, I talked about modernism as kind of an elitist movement in the lecture. And the worst, that would be like the populists, the lower class people. Those are the people who are really moved to action in things like the Russian Revolution. So he sees in some ways that the natural order of society is being upended. Then the second part of the poem, the second stanza, is about, what this feeling that something is coming, that the apocalypse is coming. And specifically, it comes in this form of like a sphinx-like monster. And that contrasts with the first coming of the Messiah, right, which is Jesus. Our civilization is so debased and terrible that what we are going to get is a monster. So, you guys, everybody who was thinking about religious interpretations is right. I mean, although it's not really necessarily a religious poem, it's mostly Yeats using religion to talk about how he feels like the world is ending. This is one of my favorite poems. Stevie Smith is a female British poet, and this is her poem, Not Waving But Drowning. The speaker is the dead man, which is a little unusual. And we get this disjunction between what has happened, which is that he drowned, and what society perceived happened, which is that he was waving, he was having fun. And he's like, no, you were wrong. I was not waving, but drowning. And we get this kind of drama of miscommunication and the sense of the alienation of the individual from society, right? Society did not recognize what we might call his depression or his loneliness, his isolation of the dead man. Society still doesn't understand what has happened. And so we see this big difference between the individual and society, and how society is kind of failing the individual here. And if that third stanza, I want to read cold. He says it was too cold always, right? Just kind of like after death. And this is a play. We get the two meanings of cold. The water is cold, but he means the world was too cold. And he was too isolated. He was too lonely. I was too far out all my life. And again, we have this perception of the world is not a warm and orderly place. This is not that Victorian confidence. Or even in a poem like Invictus, where bad things were happening to the speaker, they were still positive and filled with confidence. No, this is about alienation, isolation, loss. This one really quickly. I had talked in the lecture about imagism. This is an imagist poem. But so that makes it modern. It's this new kind of poetry that comes about in the modernist era. It also it takes place in a very urban setting. This subway, if you go down into the subway, the metro is the Paris subway. And if you ever like see a bunch of people, like, yeah, their faces might be kind of blurry and indistinct, but also beautiful. Not all modernist poetry is like really depressing. I feel like this poem by Auden, The Unknown Citizen, is pretty easy to understand. It's really ironic. So, the main point, if we go to the last two lines, was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. Had anything been wrong, we certainly should have heard. Um, these are real questions because the whole list of things about this person, who notice is only referred to by a number, is this loss of individuality and how new modern society with its mass production kind of erases the individual. There are all these reports on this guy. They have all this data on him and statistics and stuff, but they never really knew him at all. This is kind of a more ironic and kind of funny exploration of what Not Waving But Drowning did, which is that modern society really can't recognize the individual or ignores the individual. So you can see that. This poem by Auden is more complicated because it has to do more with historical things that were going on at the time. And modernist poetry can be explicitly political. If you remember in the lecture, I said that we would read authors who were conservative and authors who were like more liberal. Yeats was that kind of, and T.S. Eliot later are very conservative, much more sympathetic to conservative movements and even perhaps the emerging kind of fascist movements in Germany and Italy and places like that in the 20s and 30s. Auden is more sympathetic to more liberal leftists. Auden is sympathetic to the communist side in Spain. And so in Spain, we get the civil war in the 30s that is a proxy war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and we have the Nazi fascists on one side and the communists on the other. Auden supports the communists, and this poem was written to support efforts to raise money for ambulances for that side during the war, so to provide healthcare and healthcare services. This poem is divided into sections, and I've tried to divide the sections here. So it starts out with yesterday. And this is the past. And so, explorers going to China, trying to divine things by water, and inventing clocks. Like, these are all things that happened way in the past, like almost medieval past and before that. Gargoyles, etc. So, okay, that's yesterday, but we get this repetition. Today is the struggle. Okay, and that struggle is the Civil War in Spain. So that was yesterday. Then this slide is all about kind of basically everything that's happening right now. So we are in the present. And we get this kind of moment where the nations cry out, and they cry out to God, and they basically ask for God to descend as an answer. And we get this kind of images of God as a furious father or a mild engineer or a dove, but they want God to answer them. And what we get is, oh no, right, I am not the mover. God is not going to intervene in human history. He says, not today, not to you. And then he says, like, basically, I am what you make of me. What's your proposal? To build the just city? I will. Or is it the suicide pact? Very well. I accept, for I am your choice, your decision. So what's basically happening here is he's saying people decide what will happen. We could decide something good will happen to build the just city, or we could decide on a suicide pact. And then he says, I am Spain. What he's saying is the struggle in Spain is going to be determined by what people do. And this poem is explicitly about a call to action. So then Okay, so what people decide will happen to Spain. Then we get the future. So we've been the past, the present, and now we're in the future. And all of these things might happen in the future, right? Like we might have these like scientific discoveries about radiation. We might do things like just like hobby things like photograph ravens or do music or breed terriers. But today is the struggle. Tomorrow we'll have poetry and walks by the lake and stuff like that. But today we don't. We have the struggle. And he talks about things that are happening today that are related to the war, the deliberate increase in the chances of death. Political meetings and stuff, that also happens during wartime. The makeshift consolations, the shared cigarette. And we end with these 4 lines. The stars are dead, the animals will not look. We are left alone with our day, and the time is short, and history, to the defeated, may say alas, but cannot help or pardon. So, this is the day, this is the moment, this is the struggle. It's the struggle for Spain and who will win. And he says, look, God's not going to intervene. This is the people's choice and what people do. And if we lose, right, to the defeated, history may say, man, that is too bad. That is really bad. What happened to you? But that is not going to help you. So in other words, like it's not enough to like be on the right side of history. You have to win because no one is going to help you if you lose. And so the poem ends with a call to action to support the other side of the war in Spain. So this is a very explicitly political poem. A lot of modernist literature is more political. Shield of Achilles, one of my favorite poems. I'm just going to burn through it really quickly though. This should remind you of Grecian Urn and the Lady of Shalott because we're going to get this thing that has a picture of everything on it. And actually we're going to get 2 pictures. So this is Auden is kind of riffing on this moment in Greek classical poetry where Hephaestus, the god of the forge, makes Achilles, who is the son of a nymph, Thetis, but he's also human, so he's mortal. He makes him this fabulous shield. And what Thetis wants is she wants to see this kind of vision of beautiful Greek society, right? Vines, olive trees. She wants to see that on the shield. And I've put all the Thetis parts on the white part and the other parts are on the pink part of the slide here. So what she wants to see are things that are beautiful, classical ideals about perhaps fighting or society. And what she gets, what Hephaestus puts on the shield is something different, and it reflects more modern warfare. And this poem is written post World War II. So we don't get a field, we get this kind of bare plain, a million eyes, a million boots in line. You should think of those newsreels of like, the Nazis goose stepping, in parade. All of these people in armies, out of the air, a voice without a face, this is like a radio, proved by statistics that some cause was just. And then the army marches away. And not to success, right? Somewhere to grief. So instead of something noble and heroic and magnificent, this is very modern. It's boring, it's bland, but it's massive, right? There are a million soldiers. So instead of seeing like beautiful religious ritual, instead we get this debased version of religious ritual, and a reference to the crucifixion, and also probably the Holocaust, right? Barbed wire enclosed in an arbitrary spot where bored officials lounged, and then we get the 3 pale figures are bound to the 3 posts, and people, right? They were small and could not hope for help, and no help came, right? These people are tortured and killed. And again, it's in a very modern way. It's businesslike. It's not even necessarily like we might think of like classically grandiose and tragic. The officials are bored and they joke as they torture and kill these people in the same way that, right, like millions of people are dying in the Holocaust, and you see pictures of SS officers laughing on at picnics, right? We get this terrible juxtaposition of everyday life with horrible tragedy. So again, she's looking for these things on his shield, and instead we see this kind of horrible society where there is no empathy, um, that girls are raped, that two boys knife a third, were axioms to him who'd never heard of any world where promises were kept, or one could weep because another wept. This depiction of modern life that we get on Achilles' shield is terrible, but it's terrible in a very particular modern way. It is faceless, it is monolithic, it is bureaucratic, it again grinds down individuals. And the final stanza tells us, right, that she is terrified at what the god had wrought to please her son, the strong, iron-hearted, man-slaying Achilles, who would not live long. Achilles famously chooses a short life spent in warfare and for fame rather than a happy, uneventful life where he becomes forgotten. And Achilles is deeply connected to war. And what Auden is saying is this vision of modern warfare pleases Achilles, but he's not going to live very long. What does that say about our society? How long is our society going to live? Okay, again, we have maybe not apocalyptic despair, but we do have a sense of our civilization is decayed, but compared to ancient Greek civilization, what Thetis wants to see, our civilization is debased, our civilization is in disarray, there's something terribly wrong with modern society. I understand that this was probably the much more difficult poem to read. And remember when I said modernism could be an elitist movement, and it embraces difficulty and challenge. And that is what Eliot does with The Hollow Man. It starts with two allusions. One from Mr. Kurt's He Dead from The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and the other A Penny for the Old Guy, which is related to Guy Fawkes Day, which is a particular kind of holiday based on a historical event in England. Eliot's poetry is highly elusive, highly fragmented, and instead of trying to make like linear sense of what, I just encourage you to kind of try and get a sense of like the tone or the things that this poem evokes. Starts with, we are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men. We're hollow inside. There's nothing inside of us. We're empty. We don't have any wonderful thoughts or things like that. He says we're filled with straw. We'll come back to that. And then we get these kind of like terrible images of rats' feet over broken glass. Death's other kingdom. People who have crossed into death's other kingdom, people who have died, remember us, if at all, not as lost violent souls, but only as the hollow men. So the dead themselves like don't think very highly of us. They think that we're empty inside. And we get this kind of nightmare landscape. Part 2, Eyes I Dare Not Meet in Dreams. We're back again in Death's Dream Kingdom. We see a broken column. We have this faint hint of wind. He says, let me wear deliberate disguises, crowskin, cross staves in a field. Okay, that is a scarecrow. Remember, we're going back to that. We're hollow men and we're stuffed with straw. We get this image of the scarecrow, that we are kind of like nothing. And the place we are in is this dead land, the cactus land. Like it's like a desert. That's cactus land. It's dry. There's no river. Think of the landscape in Child Roll Into the Dark Tower Came, and that is very much where we are. But we are not going to get that like go for it ending that Child Rolling gets. We're in the nightmare. We're in the nightmare landscape, but there's really no getting out of it. Um, so we're in a place with no water, no nourishment, no rejuvenation. It's just dry and barren, nothingness. The eyes are not here. We're in the Valley of Dying Stars. We're in a hollow valley. We're sightless, so we can't see anything now. That means probably not literally sightless, but it means more like we have no insight, we have no wisdom, because, right, there's nothing in our heads but straw. We're empty. So we are empty men. There's nothing inside us. And this, I realize it's small, but I wanted to get it all on one page. The last section is very fragmented, and we see Eliot doing something that he'll do a lot, which he juxtaposes something that we might say is from like low culture or popular culture, which is a nursery rhyme. Here we go round the prickly pear, prickly pear. This is mulberry bush, but he changes it a little bit. So we get this nursery rhyme that is something children would sing. And then we get "For thine is the kingdom," right? Part of the Lord's Prayer. Notice we don't get the full prayer. We only get fragments of it because we're not capable of getting full religious absolution in Eliot's world. We're only capable of a tiny fragment. And then we get the shadow, right? Between, right, these things, the idea and the reality, etc., the conception and the creation involves the shadow. So this idea that we're separated between these things are separated, these things are no longer connected. Notice how the little snippet from the Lord's Prayer gets even shorter, right? For thine is the kingdom, for thine is, life is, for thine is the, gets even more fragmented, more short, less connection. Like all these little fragments and snippets and pieces in this poem show us that society is the modern society, modern civilization is the dry, dusty place with no rejuvenation. We have no insights. We have nothing in our heads. Like look at even what's in our head at this little end, and we just have scraps of nursery rhymes and a prayer that we can't even fully remember. And we end with, this is the famous ending, this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. The world isn't going to end like Yeats's apocalyptic vision of the Sphinx monster coming back and probably killing us all. It's not going to end in war. It's just going to peter out as our civilization dries up and kind of floats away and everything falls to pieces. It's not going to end with a bang. It's going to end with a whimper. It's just going to kind of leave. So even our end isn't going to be gloriously tragic. It's just going to be kind of like blah, because that's what our society is like. I do want to say this, not all modernist poetry, although a lot of it is this depressing. And people like Eliot and Auden specifically, right, did not maintain their level of depression about society and civilization. Both Eliot and Auden later in their lives will go through explicit religious conversions and write other poems that are more filled with happiness and positivity. But when they were working in the modernist period, their poems were definitely not, right? We see that despair, we see that perception that civilization is just in disarray, that modern society breaks down the individual, that individuals are alienated from modern society. We can see the elitism of a lot of modernist literature. This is not meant for masses of people to read. This is meant for only a select kind of elite few to read. We see all of those things in this poetry. And you can also see, I want to say something about the Holloman too. We do have kind of some rhyme. There are parts of it that have meter, but it's mostly unrhymed and unmetered. This is free verse, which is also a new kind of poetry in the modernist period. In the same way that stream of consciousness is a new way of narrating the novel, and they're both pretty difficult to follow. So modernists have not only challenging ideas, they have very challenging ways of expressing those ideas. So I hope this helps with some of the poetry. As always, you can email me or text me if you have questions. And hopefully, this should also help as you work on studying for the final. Thank you.